there's any detail, if there's any detail you need to check on, then that will be available shortly after this session concludes. There will be a little bit of time for Q&A. If you have any thoughts, comments, questions along the way, please feel free to use the chat box, and we'll get to those after Melissa has concluded. If you go to the next slide. Thank you. So as I say, this is the first Lunch and Learn in 2024. In the latter half of 2023, we heard about artificial intelligence from Virginia Tech, and we heard about microtransit initiatives from OmniRide. And so this season continues to kind of reflect one of NVTA's many roles in our own Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, which was approved in May of 2021 and updated in November of 2022. And we really are looking at, through our Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, at technology from the perspective of, does it support our vision for Northern Virginia, or is it possibly in conflict? So we tend to not look at technology from the perspective of it being something shiny and new, but more from the perspective of, will it help us to achieve our goals? I think, Griffin, you may be putting a link to our Transportation Technology Strategic Plan into the chat box. So feel free to take a look at that and follow up if you have any questions on that. The Transportation Technology Strategic Plan is a living document. Obviously, technology doesn't stand still, and neither does our plan. These Lunch and Learn sessions are intended to be about 45 minutes long. And we hopefully you will be able to stay with us until the end, but we don't want to eat into your valuable time beyond that. So that's our target. And generally speaking, our Lunch and Learn focus is on sharing information with practitioners, citizens, policymakers, and any others who are interested, up to a cap of 100 people, that could lead to actionable innovations in the near term. Before I hand over to Melissa, I just want to actually ask Griffin. I think we've got a couple of polls to take a few seconds over to just help us understand our audience's perspective this morning. So poll one is just to assess your level of familiarity with the concept of performance parking. 5 options there. Please click away, and in a couple of seconds we'll be able to see how you all feel about this topic, what you know about this topic. So Griffin, when you're ready, or Ian, do you want to share the poll results?
Waiting for a few more participants, Keith, to answer the poll for sure. Still seeing that 0 people participated in the poll.
Oh, well, I participated, so
okay. Let me end it and see.
Yeah, I'm seeing 23 on my end. I think we're good.
Okay, I'll end it and share.
Okay. Across the board there, then Melissa, I'm not sure how that affects how you want to pitch what you say, but you've got everybody from not familiar at all to very familiar, who maybe folks working with you in Arlington, but the majority of people, well, not the majority, but certainly plurality of people are in the somewhat familiar category. Ian, do you have another poll?
Yes, let me stop sharing this one and then launch the second one. All right, everyone seeing poll number 2?
Yep.
Great.
So generally speaking, what outcome, benefit, of performance parking do you find most impactful? Now, obviously, if you've said that you're not familiar with this might be a hard question to answer, but certainly from your expectations and what you would like to see come from this, click away. And if you do choose the other option, please specify what you have in mind in the chat box. Okay, and when you're ready, let's take a look at those responses.
All right, sounds good. Give it about 5 more seconds.
Okay, thank you. Increased parking availability saves time. I guess saves time parking is by far and away the greatest benefit that's expected, and also incentivizing and improving accessibility for transit and active transportation as well. And then perhaps later on we can look at if there's any responses to other after Melissa speaks. But for now, thank you for your responses. And if we could advance to the next slide and hand over to Melissa.
All right, thank you guys so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction, Keith. And I know I've got someone navigating slides for me. So I'm Melissa McMahon, Parking and Curbspace Manager for Arlington County, and I'm going to tell you a bit about our performance parking pilot project in commercial corridors. Next slide, please. Thank you. And you can go right on. I guess it's important here for me to note our pilot is made possible by the Virginia Department of Transportation's Innovation and Technology Transportation Fund. So that is it's providing 100% of the funding for this pilot, and it's really allowing Arlington County and the region to learn from technology in an area that is really budding, and it's going to help us with our curb space management. Next slide. The purpose of our pilot project is to make metered parking spaces more available more often, and it's going to do that by using pricing changes and the sharing of new useful information about parking options in real time. The goal of those changes is ultimately to reduce those negative impacts that we see associated with the search for metered parking. So we hear this from the community in various ways: double parking, cruising for parking, erratic and dangerous driving behavior, and ultimately the extra VMT and emissions from that search time. And there's also the concern that folks might go somewhere else to do business if it's really hard to find parking in a neighborhood. Next slide. I also get asked, why this particular pilot project? Why this money toward this purpose? And ultimately, it comes down to the fact that our curb is finite and demand for it is growing. So Arlington County is increasing in jobs and population, but we're not building a lot of new roads. We don't have the space for that. So we are really looking at finite curb space and trying to make the most of it and use it as wisely as we can. Pricing and better information are proven tools to manage the curb. So we wanted to be able to use those here. And our 2009 Master Transportation Plan directed us to look at this specifically. It directs us to utilize parking meter pricing strategies that vary by hour and location to better match parking availability and demand. And it seems like a long time ago, 2009, but there have been, as most folks know, you put a lot into a master transportation plan. There are a lot of policies, there are a lot of action items, and it sometimes takes time to get an action item into place and to actually initiate the work that needs to go behind it. Again, we receive 100% grant funding support for this due to a strong fit between the questions we have and want to answer with this technology project and what the Commonwealth hopes to learn about curb management technology. And this pilot will test these tools in our community to see if it's going to work on our streets and with our user populations. Can this work? The answer is yes. We've actually seen pilot projects like this one in many other communities over the years. I highlight 3 on this slide. I won't go into a lot of detail on them, but I encourage you to check out the existing documentation on the San Francisco pilot project, which included also in-ground sensors with 2 years of periodic, well-communicated price changes and the benefits they were able to measure from that. Washington, D.C. also had a similar pilot project, and Boston as well, among others. And in all of these instances, the project resulted in many of the outcomes that we are trying to see. And it didn't result in some of the feared negative outcomes. For instance, parking rates didn't necessarily all go up, and parking availability did improve. The customer experience and perception of ease of parking did improve. And we want to be able to measure that here, see if we can get those kinds of benefits to be achieved here. I also think it's important to mention what our pilot project is not doing. And so for purposes of communicating with our community and with our board, we emphasize it's a pilot, and local governments sometimes struggle to do pilots to try things out, but this is in fact, it's exactly what it is. It's not a commitment to a long-term path. It is a test of technology and management process, and it's going to allow us to learn and report back to our board on what paths might be possible in the future. So it's very exciting for me as a staff member to be able to undertake something like this, because we have enough time to learn a lot and to actually have that inform future policy decisions. This pilot project also doesn't seek to increase overall parking meter revenue across the board. That's a question I get a lot, and revenue is just not a goal of this project. We will be monitoring it though, and we will of course have to report on any revenue impacts that are associated with the next several years of work. This project does not aim to increase all metered parking rates across the board. It does not decrease the number of reserved accessible spaces we have on streets, another important question I get. And it is not dynamic pricing in the sense that it's not going to create fast changing metered pricing that people can't predict. It's not like our express lanes, and it's not like surge pricing by ride hail companies. It's also not going to change the type of curb use from metered parking to something else entirely. Next slide. The overall project design kind of looks like this. It's iterative and data driven and occupancy based. So we essentially are coming out of a first phase of installation of technology equipment, and we're going to go into 2 years of quarterly price changes. At least that's our design. And so what we'll see is a price change and availability of information. We will spend a couple months gathering data, looking at that data, conducting analysis on those data, and then proposing another price change and management change, and communicating those changes to the community, and then again watching for a couple months and gathering data and analyzing data to see what the impacts are of that next change. So it is iterative, and it is intended, this iterative process is intended to happen for the next couple of years. This is Arlington, the map of Arlington County, or most of it, portion of it. It's showing our project area, and our project area is actually pretty big. We have about 4,500 metered parking spaces that are participating in the project, and those are those orange highlighted road segments within our planning, within 2 Metro Rail sort of planning corridors, our Roslyn-Ballston corridor and our Crystal City, Pentagon City, and Potomac Yard corridors and the neighborhoods therein. And the technology that we're looking at, we're actually using a technology that is a wireless embedded sensor in the ground. So that's what you kind of see on the left-hand side of the screen. The technology works by that sensor detecting a vehicle's presence or absence. It communicates that to a gateway, which we have mounted. We have about 75 to 80 gateways mounted throughout these project corridors. If you could go back for a sec. And it communicates that message to the gateway. The gateway sends that information to the cloud, and the cloud, in the cloud, we have software interfaces both for project management on the back end, as well as ways that the public will be able to see these data. They'll be able to see price and occupancy in real time. And so as of today, we've been underway and implementing this project for about a year, and that first year has been our technology installation phase primarily. It has an outreach component, which I'll talk a bit more about, but this is just sort of a snapshot of what this looks like when we look at the logistics of installation on the back end. We have about 4,200 sensors actually installed in these roughly 4,500 spaces in the corridor. That difference, as you can imagine, is when we have maintenance of traffic plans, construction, right-of-way construction, and other kinds of things that impede our access to a specific space. So we continue to fill in tiny gaps throughout that plan network. And we're talking about 440-ish block faces that are installed with this technology throughout these two planning areas. I've got a couple slides here to show you some of our data visualization. So again, these are back-end ways that we take the live real-time data that we can get, and we use the API access that we have to these data to start to think about what it's saying about use of the curb and how we might manage it. So this is an example data visualization from August data. It is showing a 3-hour parking peak period from 11 a.m. To 2 p.m. And what it's showing is block faces with grouped into relative occupancy. So the blue are the lowest occupancy block faces. This is Pentagon City. Costco is kind of smack in the middle of this picture, and we've also got the Fashion Center Mall. The white block faces are what I would almost call the Goldilocks occupancy, 40 to 80%. Typically, when you go to those blocks, you are going to find a space, but they're also being well used. And then the red block faces are greater than 80% occupied in this instance, in this period of time. And those are the trouble spots as far as if you're looking for parking there, you're probably not going to find it, and you're going to be frustrated, and it might influence your parking and driving behavior. Next slide. We also are working on visualizations that help us think about activity within an area over a given time. So these visualizations are Ballston using October data, and this is occupancy by time of day and day of week. So again, with our sensor network, we are able to accumulate this consistently. And this is showing Monday through Friday in Ballston, a sort of typical lunchtime peak and a typical evening peak of activity. And then we can compare that to what happens on a Saturday in Ballston. And on a Saturday in Ballston, we actually get more consistent lunchtime, midday through evening activity and a longer period of busyness on the Saturday evening. And then we look at our Sunday activity. And this is fun for us when you think about managing your curb. Arlington doesn't meter on Sundays, so no one's charging people to park in these spaces during this day. And you can see that we have a much stronger high peak occupancy throughout the mid, through the afternoon, and into the evening hours on a Sunday. And this is a consistent pattern. We see this across neighborhoods. We see this across periods of time. And we see it as representing kind of that base case of what happens when you don't manage the curb, when you don't use pricing to change people's behavior at all. And so I think a lot of people choose to do some stuff on a Sunday because they know they don't have to pay. And it also might change how you use it. So you might have been planning for a Sunday activity anyway, but given that you aren't paying for the time you're staying, it might change how long you stay in one place. So we'll be able to look at that. We are also, as a part of this project, specifically providing interfaces for folks in the public to use the data that we have. And this is hopefully going to be rolling out really soon for folks. I have 2 screenshots up here for mobile-friendly web page and an app, the app being on the left-hand screenshot, that's showing the data and how one might be able to use it. So you can zoom into a street, you can see the relative occupancy level of that street, and in the app instance, you can also potentially navigate yourself to the location where there's an available space that you're interested in. So we've got these 2 public interfaces that we'll be launching. We will be launching public APIs for third-party developers and researchers to use at the same time. So those are essentially the same APIs that we can use on the back end. We will be launching dynamic message display demos out in the street. And the idea behind that is really that we don't necessarily want everyone to be looking at their phones when they're driving. And for folks who are new to the area, they might not have this stuff downloaded. So they can benefit from understanding the relative availability of parking as they've come into a neighborhood and are making a decision about where to drive. So it's really to increase their certainty. So we're going to try that out too. We will also be launching a public-facing Power BI dashboard, and that's more for exploration for the community to look at the data, to aggregate it in different ways, to look at different time periods. So that's going to be available on our project webpage. And we do expect very early integration with Park Mobile. So I don't have a screenshot of that here, but Park Mobile being the prime mobile, the vendor that provides mobile payment options for folks to park in Arlington in our street metered spaces, they will also be able to show these data on their app. Next slide. Our first phase of the project has had a lot of outreach and engagement, and there's a lot more to come. So this is really a multi-year project, and it has different types of engagement for each phase based on the type of work we're doing. And in the first phase, it was really around informing people of the nature of the project, the fact that it's happening, how they could benefit from it, and to also get feedback on the relative prioritization of project goals. We've distributed over 600 decals with QR codes in our Metro Rail corridors, in the project areas on the meters, the multimeters. And we've had over 1,700 visits to the project page from those codes. We conducted pop-ups with lots of interactions in the summer, this past summer, in different locations. And we've also done door-to-door outreach, touched over 260 businesses and large residential buildings through that door-to-door outreach. Next slide. We've also conducted a lot of more traditional engagement with our key stakeholder groups. So this is just sort of a laundry list of commissions and stakeholders that we've done presentations similar to this for, answered their questions, gotten their feedback on the project, and had it help to inform us on the strategies that we're going to be taking as we undertake this next phase of the project. Next slide. And what this brings us to is we are in the midst of an advertised ordinance decision-making process. So our county board advertised a proposed temporary ordinance on January 20th. And we need a temporary ordinance because here, before now and up to now, the parking meter pricing is set in code. It's hard coded, and it's a board decision. And it's often been a decision that's set on a sort of a budget cycle or an annual cycle, and it doesn't change all that much. But for the pilot to work, we actually have to change prices administratively, and we have to do them a bit more frequently. And if we had to go to the board each time, it wouldn't make the project viable. So this temporary ordinance proposes a limited duration of time, and it's 2 years, basically, with a sunset at the end of it, for no more than quarterly changes that staff, essentially authority delegated to the manager and designee to be able to make these rate changes based on project goals and based on the data we're getting from the project. And so it's advertised today, and we're aiming for a February or March action by the board to enable us to move forward with the next stage of the project. And this might be my last slide or second to last slide. So I did want to highlight some insights that we have thus far in the project, and obviously we're right in the middle of it, so we don't have all of our learnings yet, but we've certainly learned a lot. We've learned that parkers ignore temporary no parking signs, and I say that with humor, I guess, because we had to put up a lot of temporary no parking signs in order to get out into the right of way and install these sensors in each space. We had to delineate our parking spaces for the first time, and to get that work done, we had to basically push people out of the parking spaces so that we could roll through neighborhood by neighborhood and get this stuff installed. And we spent a lot of time towing, and it was time consuming for the project. It's obviously not great for customers, and I would just say we need a better way to get parkers to sort of adhere to and understand the importance of adhering to the temporary no parking signs that folks use when they do work in the right of way. We also observed that our local permitting process had to be adapted for a fast-moving and broad-reaching installation effort. This was not your typical close down a section of street for a period of time and then you're done. This had to cover 2 entire Metro Rail corridors, and we had to go through them relatively quickly, so we had to develop some new permitting processes to make that happen. I would also say the fluidity and unpredictability of right-of-way construction does conflict with hardware maintenance for a project like this. So we need to be able to know more ideally in one place about what is happening in the right-of-way. And I did the screenshot that I gave you earlier in this presentation of our Power BI dashboard, where we were managing the installation and being able to see our broader network and see data from the network. It's actually been really exciting to see what we can do with Power BI, with open data sets that are internal to the county and that have been provided to the community in the past. And it really just makes us ready for more, really ready for more internal data sets, more open data to be able to integrate and make better decisions with. We've also learned from our preliminary data, this is the first time we've been able to compare transactions from our meters to activity in the actual spaces. And people really don't like to pay to park. So we've seen basically a third of parking time in our metered spaces that's used is paid for, roughly. And it was a real surprise for a lot of folks looking at the data, especially because we look at each other in the room and everyone says, but I always pay to park. So who's not paying to park? So we're really exploring what this relationship is and what it's telling us about the nature of use of the space, because there could be different user types that are more and less predisposed to pay when there is actually a meter there and the meters are running. And it's not a perfect clear-cut answer with duration of stay, although we do think that there's a relationship. So we're continuing to explore the data to understand that more. We are also aware from our outreach that accessible space users are going to be both more price sensitive and more location sensitive. And we are going to have to look out for the impacts of differential pricing if, as we move forward, we choose to change prices at accessible spaces in a different way than at the regular spaces. Today, they're all the same, and we do meter our accessible spaces, and historically that was necessary because unmetered accessible spaces were used more fraudulently. People were fraudulently reproducing placards, and there was a lot of enforcement challenge when accessible spaces were free. And making them the same price as regular spaces eliminated a lot of that incentive to use them fraudulently. And again, fraudulent use of accessible spaces deteriorates their utility to the folks who really need them. So we want to make sure that our project does not create that problem over again. And so we'll be looking at that really carefully. The occupancy data are immense. They're accurate and they're really exciting. So we're looking forward to continuing to explore them over the next couple of years. And we also already know that there are no software interfaces off the shelf that have all the functionality we need. And we have a big team with a bunch of vendors. However, we have experienced that too many vendors and software platforms with different ways of looking at the data can make more work for the project leads rather than less work. So it's tricky to both learn what you need and try to have the interfaces to manage it and provide it all at the same time. But that's, I guess, part of the excitement of doing a project like this. Next slide. And that is the end. So for folks watching and for folks looking at this later, that's the website location where our project page is, my contact information, and a couple other team members' contact information if you'd like more information about the project. And I'm looking forward to answering questions and having a discussion.
Melissa, thank you so much. Wow, so much information there. I've got a couple of questions on my own, but I'm going to not abuse moderators' power. I'm actually going to ask Griffin if he's got some questions either from the chat box or provided to us separately. So Griffin, do you want to start working us through that?
Sure. I'll start with the chat box questions first and then move on to some personally I have. I'll try and keep my regional planner hat on and not my personal one. So I'll start with the chat box question from Harun. Have there been positive impacts on the roadway traffic flows measured because of the improved parking?
So we haven't made any changes yet, so we don't have the impacts yet, but that is our goal. Basically, what we've done to date is install all the technology, set up the software interfaces for analysis, and we're about to roll out the necessary public APIs so that others can use the data coming from the system. And as soon as we have board authorization, we'll be able to start that process of administrative price changes that are reflective of the data that we're seeing. And so that goal would be within the next 6 months to a year, we'll really have had a few price changes under our belt, and we'll be able to speak to whether we're seeing some of the benefits that we're looking for as a part of the project.
We have another question. Will Arlington look for areas where parking is underutilized and some curb space might be used for other purposes? For example, pedestrian bump outs, green infrastructure, bike parking, street eateries, and EV chargers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is yes. Not just, so we will be looking at underutilization. In one way that we're looking at that is simply that if I sort of harken back to the slide that I showed you that showed some blue curb areas, not too far away from some red and white curb areas, by doing a price change, ideally, one of the things we do is we might raise a price in the highest demand areas and lower a price in the lowest demand areas so that parkers think, oh, I have choices. I could park a little further from my initial destination, walk a couple extra blocks, but pay a lower price. And if a combination of the information about where the availability is and the price will start to shift parkers across the street better, so we don't have those really intense demand areas that create bad experience and those negative externalities. Now, because we'll also be seeing this broadly in areas with highest demand, we're going to be looking at turnover, and we're going to be looking at how many customers are served in those areas, because we might see greater turnover, but relatively stable occupancy even with price changes. And that would still be a benefit to a neighborhood, right? Because if you can serve more customers, more community members with a given space in a period of time, that's good for the businesses, that's good for the curb space, that's good for the functionality of the curb. But we'll also be able to see if there are needs. For instance, if there's super high turnover and low payment compliance and some other things going on a curb, that space might not benefit most from being a metered 2-hour parking space. It might benefit from being a pickup drop off, more sort of allocated space. And then similar to the questioner's original point, the lowest demand areas, depending on where they are, they might benefit from being allocated to different things, or for us to understand there's less parking availability sensitivity there. And you could, I mean, I would say in Arlington, our highest priority is pedestrian safety and access. So we've had some of our meters pulled out of the ground for a bulb out already. Oh, pardon me, not meters, sensors. So even within this small period of time of implementing the technology, the bulb out improvements to shrink a crosswalk to improve pedestrian safety and access, that's always going to be the first priority. Now, ideally, we know in advance and we don't install a sensor, but that's where I get back to the internal flows of data. The open data around permits and around project activities can really help inform decision making. And we're always going to defer a metered activity to a pedestrian safety activity.
That makes a lot of sense. We've got another question. Curious to hear about if or how you're thinking about curb data specification to manage the information coming from this project.
Yeah, so the open data API that we will be making available uses CDS. So it is the current, what we understand is the current best practice for curb data in the open data universe. And this is definitely not my strong suit. So I don't know all of the technicalities behind it. But that is the goal. That is the format of the open data we'll be making available. And so the way we'll be doing it is by housing the API and historical data on the county's open data portal. So that's going to be our intended approach. So we have to do some coordination around that with our internal data folks. But yes, we actually have some other backend APIs that are not CDS that we also use, but the goal of the open data that everyone gets, and that is sort of from the project, is that it's in CDS.
Gotcha. Another question, is the county performing parking and enforcement in the paid zones to unpaid parkers?
Can you ask that one more time?
Is enforcement, like law enforcement, actually going out to the parking spaces to ticket those unpaid parkers?
So because this is the first time we've had data like this, we are coordinating directly with our parking enforcement folks, which are on a different team than the transportation division, to give them the best access they can have to our information. So the goal is to use the data about compliance to improve enforcement, but it's not. And I've gotten this question before. We don't know who is not paying. That is not that's something that the enforcement officer can tell on the sidewalk right there when they're checking to see if that plate has a valid stay active. But from the data that our project has, all we can tell is that differential between paid for time and actual occupied time. So our goal is to help the enforcement team get access to the most useful formulation of these data to help them make strategic decisions about their assets. And so they might be able to improve their enforcement routines to focus on areas with really low compliance. But then also likewise, we can look at it and say, what's actually the issue here? Is it the way the curb is used, and maybe having it be a metered space, it's not feasible to enforce, or it's not feasible because the turnover is too high and people are just not going to pay. So we're looking at those kinds of questions, and we'll be looking at them more over the course of the project.
Okay, yeah, I was interested about that too. We have another question. Will the county assess occurrence of various curb space conflicts before and after the project, such as double parking, bus stop blocking, and etc. in some of the pilot areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So VDOT is separately funding a system optimization team. It's actually a different team that's taking our data and working collaboratively with us to help us evaluate against our project goals. And so one of the examples of that is that while our project does not have funding to look at camera data, we have CCTV cameras on many of our traffic signal poles, and that separate project team is designing a set of data capture routines that will be able to actually look at that question of double parking and that erratic behavior issue associated with the trouble of finding parking. So our hope is that between their information and our information, we can actually get the answer to those questions, and we can look and see if we're seeing those benefits. And the intent is for that feedback to be fed to our project on a routine basis. So it's not like they're going to wait till the tail end to say, oh, and by the way, none of this was working, but they're actually working with us collaboratively and will be able to feed us what they see on a regular basis so that we can use it to inform decisions.
Awesome. Thanks for the questions from the chat. If I get any more, I'll read those off, but I have a couple from myself. Are there any equity concerns with the project? And if so, how are you addressing them?
That's a great question. And yes, there are some equity concerns. We've had some key stakeholders mention to us their concern that if we're raising the price of metered parking, we are differentially impacting folks who can't afford to pay as much. And what does that mean if we're making the most desired parking spaces the most expensive and expecting people to go farther away for cheaper parking. So that's one type of equity concern that we're highly aware of. And the project's baseline proposition is that increased price in some locations, targeted locations where there's this current dysfunction, will actually improve access to parking at that location. So it will, the folks who can and do choose to park in another location at a lower rate, or because they can now tell it's more available somewhere else, means that the people who are more location sensitive can park where they originally intended to. Whereas today, everybody, regardless of how much money you have, is searching for parking in the same places, and they're all struggling. So, so there is the intent that the project create more opportunity and more choice across the board, and that will make all of our curb spaces perform better. We are specifically also designing outreach, and it hasn't occurred yet, but it's designed to happen in this winter and spring, to touch point with our retail employees, who are one of the core stakeholder groups that are hard to reach, that have not necessarily given us a whole lot of feedback to date, but that we know in some instances are using street parking for their all-day parking needs while they're working a shift in a retail establishment, restaurant, or other kind of retail. And they're also lower income earners. And so we want to make sure that we understand the nature of their relationship with the street parking, why they park on the street and not in an off-street garage or lot or other location, how far they're willing to walk to parking, and like what factors play into their willingness to park or walk a certain distance. And we also know that while we're serving folks such as retail employees on the street, we're also serving customers, and businesses can do better potentially when more customers can be served in the locations that are more appropriate for customer access. And sometimes we see those conflicts if an employee is parking for a long period of time in a space that a business actually thinks is supposed to be available for their customers. So there's a lot of layers there.
For sure. No, it's a complex topic, and I'm glad the county is looking into those issues that are kind of underlying, and not many people, will think about outside of their own situation, but it's definitely something that I'm glad is happening. I guess this could be the last question. If time permits, we may have some more from the chat, but in the meantime, I'll ask this last one. What would be the first steps for a planner or somebody at their local jurisdiction who thinks that performance parking would be a good idea in their area? Like what steps can they take to actually get something moving?
That's a good question. Because on the one hand, you don't have to do a project as big as this one to try this out. And sometimes that's your first threshold, right? Because you have to figure out if you can do it with money that you have versus having to go out for a grant. Now, because of the nature of this kind of technology, our hope is that what we learn is something that can inform decisions across Virginia, across the region, and we can derive lessons learned that can then be applicable to smaller jurisdictions or smaller areas. But ultimately, we do think there's a lot of value in a period of time actually having concrete data, like real data from your spaces to inform performance decision making. And so I've actually seen this done in different ways. In Baltimore, they do something similar, but without technology. They do it with like a every 6 month or periodic real person count. And they use those occupancy counts to calibrate prices. So they do performance pricing based on occupancy. They just do it at a more manageable, like for them, a more manageable, incorporated into their normal routines way. And if you make choices like that, it's about what you really need to know. If you have a small area that you've got to address issues with, maybe you focus on that small area and you figure out what kind of data you can afford. And then I think you also figure out what are the structures that you need to influence. Like, if you've got to go to your decision-making body for an ordinance change, what freedoms can you give yourself in that to allow you to not have to do those unsustainable routines over and over again? Because that's that puts a lot more paperwork and burden on staff, and the smaller your jurisdiction, the less of tolerance you might have for those routines.
Awesome. That's super informative. I appreciate you answering all those questions. I think that's all that we have for today.
Yeah, Melissa, thank you so much for your responses to a great range of questions. I didn't even get to ask my own questions, so I think it's kind of indicative of how much interest this project has generated, and we'll certainly look to stay in touch with you in Arlington over the course of the year to see how this unfolds and what it means for us at NVTA and for the region more broadly, and obviously from Virginia's perspective, since they're putting in some of the money as well, or maybe all of the money. So let's wrap up here then. Our final session for the winter season of Lunch and Learn is March 4th. And this will be by Paul Zatkowski who is VDOT's Assistant Division Administrator for the Traffic Operations Division. And Paul will be talking or providing some insights on how to prepare projects to adapt to innovation. So I think this is going to have very widespread applicability for a lot of folks who are interested in how VDOT is doing things and how that relates to their own local projects. So we look forward to hearing from Paul next month. Please mark your calendars for that, and Griffin will be sending out an invitation for you to reserve space for that in due course.
Keith, actually, that's a typo on that date. It's actually Thursday, March 7th.
Oh, okay. It's Thursday, March 7th. Thanks for clarifying that. But make sure you send out that invite soon. Griffin and Melissa, again, thank you so much. And to everyone who joined us this morning or who subsequently watched this recording on our YouTube channel, thank you for your interest and for your time and for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you all again next month. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
I'll now be